mass communicate. Mass communicate. Mass communicate.
Benjy, welcome to Touchdowns All Day.
It's good to be here. It's good to be on the winning team with touchdowns.
Benjy, as I was preparing for this episode, I was talking to my partner and her best friend, who are kind of later days Biscuits fans, probably I think we would call them 2.0 fans. And they said, oh, we've heard of Benjy, but who is he? And I thought for a moment and I said, Benjy, the only way I can really describe who Benjy is Benjy was both the original jamband intellectual and jamband influencer. Someone who helped not only codify the concept of jam bands, the canon around particular bands, but also who created so many or envisioned so many of the things that would eventually come to define this entire culture, from specific events or phenomenon to the broader concept of how jam bands would work in society. So I've long wanted to be able to tell you the degree to which I admire and respect you for creating this culture that are being so instrumental to creating this culture that we're all a part of. But how would you define yourself? How would you describe to people who've, heard the name Benjy Eisen? Who's Benjy?
Well, I mean, ordinarily I would go for, like the comic roller. I'd say just some old guy, some grumpy old guy who's in the get off my lawn phase. Or, it also depends on who I'm talking to, because when I am introduced, oftentimes, whether it's a podcast or whether it's a lecture, whatever it is, there's two different sides that often it seem to be people want one or the other. And that's that I was originally a music writer and a music journalist. And at the time, and a lot of that actually has to do with the Disco Biscuits, because I used them as guinea pigs to do my very first interviews where I still have somewhere, and I should probably get this to you, hours of audio of me talking to the band in the van, of me working on my interview chops while they're working on how to give an interview, and there was talk back in the 1999 and 2000 about eventually this would all go to a book, but also it really just helped me become an interviewer. And then I started writing about the Disco Biscuits and Fish Online. So I have the journalist side of me that ended up taking me all the way up to Rolling Stone, and from there co-writing a New York Times best-selling book with the drummer from the Grateful Dead. But then that also led into management, which I did beginning in the 90s or in the early 2000s with the jam band that actually has some overlap with the Disco Biscuits. They were called Quagmire Swim Team. And my first my first action as their manager was to secure a sit-in with BARBER, who drove down to Mechanicsburg from Philadelphia to play a few songs with them. And then that led into eventually what I do now, which is, manage people like Billy and the Kids and Holly Bowling, Reed Mathis, Dude of Life. and I have my foot in both doors.
Here's another great word that sometimes I think of when I think of you, and that is gadfly. And I mean that in the definition used in philosophy and social sciences, which, according to Wikipedia, is a person who interferes with the status quo of a society or community by posing novel, potentially upsetting questions, usually directed at authorities. The term is originally associated with Socrates in his defense of himself on his trial for his life. Now, it's never gotten to the point where you've been on trial for life, but I feel like you have very often been the sand that is in the clam that produces the pearl. You know what I mean? You are the genesis of so many ideas, and we'll talk about those ideas, from some of the things that fare thee well, some of the things with Billy and the Kids, and so many of the things with the Disco Biscuits that have become, the pillars of the Biscuits history have come, I think, from sometimes well thought out plans, grand schemes that you've had, and sometimes from throwaway lines that you've kind of spontaneously just said in the moment that somehow gained momentum and took on a whole life of their own and became institutions. But enough of me puffing you up, Benjy. I don't want you to get a big
I was going to say,
ego.
well, the other thing that sometimes, it's when people come up to me at shows, I never know what they're going to say because they're all, it's always like, are they going to talk about the book? Or are they going to talk about something I said that pissed them off? And Fish Pundit is one of the things that I think by default, just because I do have a podcast with their lyricist, and that was another one of those weird things how it developed. But Undermined is we haven't done it for a year now, but we have another season coming up. So that's a whole other side.
That's amazing. Well, I'll say one thing is first and foremost, you are a fan.
Yeah.
And you love music, specifically improvised music. You love Fish, the Disco Biscuits, the Grateful Dead, so many different offshoots from the scene. I first remember being exposed to you when I was first learning about all of these bands from your work digesting rec music Fish, from your reviews of different versions of Bathtub Gin. Those were the things that when I was first learning about Fish and jam bands, I would go and read to kind of learn the discourse, learn the history, learn the canon. You mentioned you are the co-author with Bill Kreitzman of Deal, My 3 Decades of Drumming, Dreams, and Drugs with the Grateful Dead. I've heard you talk about your role in the Fare Thee Well shows, and we could certainly touch on that. But before all of that, I want to hear your superhero origin story. If I understand correctly, you hail from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania?
I do. I was actually not born there, but I was raised there. I was born in a small town called London, Ontario in Canada, to American parents who moved up there for a 3-year job. I popped out early on, and then they moved back down to where my mom's parents came from, which was Harrisburg.
So Harrisburg is a place that many current Biscuits fans might not realize is sort of like one of the spiritual capitals of Biscolandia. It's 20 miles from Elizabethtown, which was the location of a venue called the Blue Terrapin. It's 20 miles from Mechanicsburg, which is, we'll talk about Mechanicsburg, and it's about 90 miles from State College. Growing up in Harrisburg, how did you first get exposed to live music, going to see shows?
It was, I wasn't even aware that music was anything other than something that came out of a radio. And the few times that I walked by or somehow oversaw a band playing, I always wondered how they were doing the sound that was in the radio, not vice versa. And it wasn't a very musical family I came from. They liked Broadway musicals and classical music, but not, and maybe pre-drug era Beatles and John Denver, Peter, Paul, and Mary, maybe, but very innocent, but not very musical. And then my first real exposure was when I begged and pleaded my mom to take me to see Bon Jovi at Hershey Park Stadium when I was 12 years old. And, it was, I really hate to say that Bon Jovi was life-changing, but the live music experience was life-changing. And at the time, I would have said Bon Jovi was life-changing.
What was the path that took you from Bon Jovi to Fish and the music we now know as jam bands?
Well, that was just, once I got into music, it consumed me. I dove right into it. And part of that was, this was obviously way pre-internet. And so in order to find out information back in those days, it's either go to a library or get magazines and things like that. So I would get every single music magazine that I could. At the time, the predominant ones and the ones that I was interested in, not just Rolling Stone or Spin, but there was also Metal Edge magazine, Cream magazine, Kerrang, all these heavy metal magazines. And I would read them cover to cover. Even if I didn't like one of the bands in them or didn't know of them, I would just force myself. If I couldn't get to the article I wanted to read about Judas Priest until I first read about, Grim Reaper or some band that I didn't care about. And that way, though, I really built up my education on heavy metal music specifically. I spent a lot of time at the record store talking to record clerks, and the original social media, things like that. And friends of mine in school, we would trade tapes, but not in the way that tape trading happened with live music, but we would each commit to buying one album that weekend, and then we would dub it for the other person so we could collectively build up our music collection. And so it was basically just, it was a hobby that was an obsession for me as a 12-year-old. Oh, and then you asked how I got to the Grateful. So around the time I think I was 16, my brother introduced me to the Grateful Dead. Of course, I had seen their insignia. I saw their logo and stuff. But you think that it kind of looks heavy metalish, like the Steal Your Face. And I saw it on patches on kids that were older than me in high school that also had Ozzy Osbourne patches and Metallica patches. I was really into both of those bands. But then my brother invited me to go with him to see the Grateful Dead in June of 1991 at RFK Stadium, and I went. I didn't go with my brother. We were gonna meet down there because he was staying in DC that summer. I think he had an internship or something, and I never met up with him because instead I took a tab of acid and I referred to Bon Jovi as a life-changing experience. That was with a lowercase L and a lowercase E. So taking acid and seeing the Grateful Dead was all uppercase and in a totally different dimension. Or maybe if you believe in string theory, it was like 26 dimensions all at once, and changed my life. I wasn't a deadhead. I never would have used that term because I was into so much music. And at the same time as, even in the same breath as saying, taking acid and seeing my first Grateful Dead show changed my life, at the same time, the next day I was probably putting on Metallica or anybody that Nirvana at that point. This was 1991. So, it would have been Nirvana or grunge music. So I still had, and to me, the Grateful Dead was one step away from being what they've become now with Dead and Company, which is a museum piece, right? It was this cultural phenomenon. I had read about it in Relics magazine, and I started reading Relics magazine the way that I used to read Metal Edge, and cover to cover, reading about all these bands, reading about the Grateful Dead, and adjacent bands, and really just becoming a scholar of it for my own satisfaction, because it was just such an obsession. And I think the Grateful Dead very quickly became one of my favorite bands, and the scene was so different from the heavy metal scene, and it was much closer to who I was becoming as a person, because we're talking about formative years, so 16, 17, I, on the one hand, could hang out with metal kids and goth kids, and on the other hand, go play hacky sack with a bunch of hippie 101ers. But then as that's all forming, my mind, again, I would have probably said the Grateful Dead were my favorite band, but to say I was a Deadhead felt like I was attaching myself to something that happened before. And then on New Year's Eve, 1993, I saw my first Phish show, and that changed my life in a whole different way. That moment that it was within the first, they opened up with Llama, and probably within the first few minutes of that show, I was a Phish fan. I was a Phish head. I was like, it almost was like finding your identity. I was like, this is it. This is the scene that I'm a part of, because this is happening now. One of the things that I noticed on stage when I saw the Grateful Dead, it was watching, people from my parents' generation play music. And the audience was spanned generations, but it was definitely a lot of people that were my parents' age. Whereas when I saw Phish, everybody around me was my age. We were all college students or high school college students, and the band was barely 10 years older than us. So it spoke to me, and it all that music that I talk about was all embedded in Phish. That wasn't in the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead had jazz and bluegrass and classical, but Phish had, everything from Led Zeppelin to even Motley Crue in their DNA. The stuff that I would hear when I would go out, to the shopping mall and things like that. Like the stuff that was happening all around me, they were also absorbing. And so it spoke to that. Plus there was a humorous side of them that I really that I didn't find in the Grateful Dead that I saw in Fish. And because I was much younger than the Grateful Dead and that scene, I had a kineticism to my personality and just to life in general at that point. You're just like you're getting your yeah-yeahs out. And Fish on stage kind of mirrored that for me because of the notes per minute that they were playing and the intensity. It was much more my speed than and again, the Grateful Dead were my favorite band to that point and to this day remain up there. But Fish to me just immediately took that title.
From seeing your first Fish show at the Worcester Centrum on New Year's 1993, where did things go from there? Because we're talking 1993 at a point where the internet is still a vague concept for most people. So I'd imagine you're finding most of your information about Fish from the written word, print journals, relics, here and there where you can. But try to set the stage for another generation of jam band fans who are accustomed to discovering music on Instagram or on Spotify or Nugs. Try to paint the picture for us of once you've discovered Fish, how you went about integrating yourself into the Fish community.
Well, it's amazing that you nailed it in a way that I don't even know if you know truly yet, because the internet was just, in my mind, on New Year's Eve 93, the internet was a rumor in my mind. And my brother who was in Dartmouth, I knew was on it. I knew that it was like he could talk to his teachers or students and I through news groups, but I didn't really know much about it. And Fish there wasn't, as you said, like we couldn't take out our phones and just look everything up. And they were too much of an underground sensation to be in most of even the magazines I was reading, except for Relics. And they were mentioned in Relics, but Relics looked at them as, Relics is, now their focus is on the genre of jam bands. At the time, they were very Grateful Dead centric because the Grateful Dead were still touring. Jerry Garcia was still alive, and Relics was the social media for Deadheads at that point. It was where people got set lists. They printed, and I would get Relics, and the very first thing I would do if it was September and I was back in school, I would open up the back of Relics to find out what the Grateful Dead played that summer, because that's how you find the set lists.
Months later. And then you'd go to the classifieds in the back where you would find tape trading, tape traders and people that would be willing to record their catalog of live tapes in exchange for yours. And you would trade these lists they were always changing, but you'd mail somebody like the list of all the tapes you had, and they would mail it back, and then you would go and mail them, their shows, and they would mail it. And it was a weeks long process. And so you had to be very selective as to what shows you would get. And that leads to why reviews back then of this type of music was much more important than that is now. Because if I can only choose one set, from an entire summer tour to get, I'm going to want to read the reviews to find out which ones have the songs that I like and the jams that I like and which shows I might, not have to worry about getting. And so reviews became very, very important in that way. And with Fish, because there wasn't enough information about them, and I was instantly just floored and fascinated to the point where I changed my friendships. I went to that first Fish show with two friends of mine, a friend and his friend. And as we left that night, my mind was so blown that I remember at the diner afterwards, them talking about the show, saying, "Oh yeah, it was good, but Rush is coming in a few months, and I can't wait to see them." And I just thought, these people are now aliens to me, because I don't think they saw what I just saw, but what I just saw was earth shattering. And so I needed to find out more about it. And when I went back to school in January, back to college, I heard that Fish. There were a few other kids at my college that knew about Fish. This would have been my second semester of my freshman year, and they knew about Fish. One kid mentioned Gamehenge, which was brand new. He said, all these songs are all part of
a larger thing. And I was like, you mean they're not just singing about lizards because it's funny? And he's like, no, it actually, there's a narrative. So I was like, oh my God, there's so much I need to know. And I had this huge appetite for it. So I went to the school library and I signed up for an internet account because I had heard that on the internet that there were a few places where I could go where there were these, just forming communities of, and they were all news groups. It wasn't web pages. It wasn't message boards. But I remember, and it was very, very, very primitive. And I think the very first thing I did, I saw, like, you could see on like a list of different topics, almost like what Reddit is now, like, but instead it was a very primitive version of it, and it wasn't centralized on a web page. So I remember the first thing I saw was a list of venues that the Grateful Dead played. And so, that fascinated me. So I immediately went to that. And then the next thing was this news group called Rec Music Fish. And I went on there and it was people posting everything from, hey, I got this tape last night. I want to know does anybody know what, the band's singing about Jägermeister. Can anyone identify this from, and it was things like that. And collectively, as that community sort of formed and I saw it grow during that very semester, there were different sides to it, but mostly it was all of us kind of trading information and learning information and then compiling that information. And I compiled it. I literally had a notebook in which I would write down, somebody ran in a tray and he mentioned this about run like an antelope. And you have to trust them that they're real, and usually it turned out to be true. And I would write it down. Somebody else would say, I heard from Mike that they're working on a brand new song called this, and then they also would talk about shows. And then there was a spring tour that year in '94, and I would go into the computer lab constantly hoping for any update on Rec Music Fish, especially if there was a show. I would go into the computer lab the first thing I could the next morning so I could find the set list and hopefully a review. And it wasn't not every show had that. Sometimes it was weeks. Sometimes it'd be a taper that then would, give 5 people that tape, and then you'd have to wait till they got it in the mail, and then they would describe it for you, without you being able to hear it. And then it would be months before you could hear it sometimes.
Well, you've hit on so many important points that seem so archaic now, but that were such an important part of life as a jam band fan back then. The phenomenon of waiting for the computer lab to open, waiting in line for a machine to log on in the hopes that you can find a set list, and then relying on the written accounts of people who were there or who had heard a tape in order to convey what had happened. And what emerged were certain voices, certain people who you could trust, who you could look for their posts or search out the things that they had written in the past about past versions, knowing that they had not only a developed understanding of the music, but also a writing style that adequately conveyed what they were hearing. And, you'd find these people and they, I said earlier, the first jam band influencers, it wasn't like influencers in the Instagram sense, but it was people who were decoding and conveying their impressions of the music for people who couldn't yet hear it. And very often you had to go off of their impressions. As you were saying, you couldn't just have a hard drive with every show from tour. You had to search out and seek out those tapes, those special performances. Canons formed, the Grateful Dead had their 5/8/77 and Fish had, the Bomb Factory show. There were these iconic shows that became iconic through the efforts of these, for lack of a better term, influencers who sang the gospel, who evangelized on behalf of these shows, and who did so in a way that made you want to hear it because they spoke with passion, knowledge, humor, style. And you became one of those people. You became someone who I would go and read your reviews of different versions of Bathtub Gin and then try to find on some long list of dates. Oh, that's that date that Benjy talked about. He said that one was good. And there were other people as well in that period. But when did you go from seeking out that information to contributing to the discourse, to writing your own reviews, to being an active participant in the online conversation around Phish and jam bands?
Well, I mean, I think it was organic. Originally, it was just because I was so obsessed that I didn't want to miss one single post on Rec Music Phish, even if it was a troll, even if it was somebody just asking for groveling for tickets, or there are a lot of tape grovels, people saying, hey, I heard about the Bomb Factory. Is anybody willing to tape it for me? But I would sift through all that for information, and then just because I'm a very opinionated and sometimes loquacious person, I would, and also I come from a writing background, and it's funny to think of a background for somebody who's a college, age kid, because you don't really have a background. But what I mean by that is just, I excelled in writing. It was one of the few things that I really excelled in, the way that other kids at that age might excel in a sport. And it was one of the things where, when I would write certain things, teachers would constantly be telling myself or my parents, like, hey, there's something to this. And I saw myself as eventually I would write fiction or something. I didn't really want to write about music per se, but it became a natural synthesis because it was, well, I'm really passionate about this. And I started writing. I wanted to contribute to the community that immediately was becoming important to me and that I identified with. And so I would, whenever I went out to a show, I would come back and I would try to review it as soon as possible, so that, thinking that if everybody did this, then when there's 98% of the shows that since I can't be there, somebody else is going to do that, and I'll get to read that. And then I quickly, I think stuff like the bathtub gin reviews, it started because Charlie Dirksen was doing that for Tweezers, and then it was a process of him saying, well, you should pick a song and do that because we're getting this foundation called the Mockingbird Foundation, or we're going to compile all of this, we're going to try to compile all of these. And I just obsessively, I picked a bathtub gin and decided I wanted to hear every version, and I wanted to document every version. And I think that there's maybe it's like a neurodivergent trait or something like that, but it's like this, especially when you're that age and just that consumed by something, I had to be a completist about it. I wanted to hear every bathtub gin that I could. It wasn't even that song was my favorite more than, say, a David Bowie or a Harry Hood. It was just that it seemed like it was a good song to be able to write about. And I really learned the whole writing style from it, because I had some music vocabulary. I was at the time in a music theory class, but I didn't have a lot of music theory, and I didn't have the natural skill that musicians do. I had a guitar, and I bought it when I was 13. I had a guitar, and other kids that were my friends, they were my same age, that bought guitars around the same time. A month or two later, they were playing me songs, and I'm like, I still can't even figure out how to hold the pick, And I took lessons, and it didn't work, but I knew how to write, and I knew how to describe things, and I knew how to paint pictures and use metaphors and all of that, and it just kind of became very natural. But I started writing about bathtub gin in a way of how do you describe it to, not necessarily to someone who's hard of hearing, because they might not have that basis, but then I identified key identifiers in the song, the Rhapsody in Blue Lick, there's parts of the song that everybody knows, even if they never heard that version, the composed parts. And then, I started timing the jams, because I do think that the length of a jam is an indication of something. Not necessarily quality, but it's an indication of probably of the level or the commitment to improvisation. And if something's working or not, because if something's not working in a jam, they can ripcord it and end it, versus, patiently doing something like the Riverport gin, or whatever that goes over that magical 20-minute mark. So I was doing that, and I was surprised that I became such a prominent member of the community, because in my mind, it was like, well, everybody should be in the computer lab reading every single thing about this band and then telling every single thing that they know, you know? And yeah, I mean, it kind of just went from there.
Where were you in school at this point?
I was at Simon's Rock College, which is now, at the time, it was part of Bard University, but it's now called Bard College because it's a satellite. It's an early admissions campus, and it's in Great Barrington, Massachusetts.
I ask because jam band culture was extremely regional back then. And based on where you lived, you would not only have your own local jam bands, and we'll get to the term jam bands. I keep using scare quotes around it, even if I'm not actually raising my index finger and middle finger when I say it, because the term was very much still coming into existence at this point. But you'd have your bands, but you'd also have your network of fans and your tape trading network. You'd have your elder heads who saw that show in 91 or saw that show back in the day and had the tapes. And I very much at Brown had a group of older heads when I was a freshman, sophomore, who were maybe juniors or seniors, grad students even, who I would just kind of sit at their feet and absorb every bit of knowledge I could from them, tape every tape I could get, borrow the books that they had on their shelf, you know, Skeleton Key or David Gann's books. They, you know, tell me about the Grateful Dead Hour, or they brought me to my first Phish show. What was the scene like at Bard?
Well, there were definitely kids. There was one kid in particular in my dorm who had about as many Phish tapes as I did, but we were very different types of people. And I remember being frustrated to the point where that he liked what I liked, to the point where he called the song "My Friend." He called it "Knife." And I used to say, well, that's the difference between Jeff and I. You know, like he views it as "Knife" and I view it as "My Friend." We're, you know, but then I think I got my friends into Phish because I remember and the way I did it. It was almost like a cult initiation. Is we would get high and I would play them "You Enjoy Myself," which was the gateway for me. I was in when I first heard Phish, I was before seeing them live on New Year's Eve. I was in my freshman year in the dorms, and we were in my friend's room around in a circle around a bong, and he put on Junta, and "You Enjoy Myself" came on, and before it got to the end, I remember my ears were just like, you know, I just immediately I couldn't even hang out with my friends anymore. I had to borrow the album. The girl I was dating came over to my room later on that night, and we started having sets. And I had Junta on, and it got to Union Federal, which is, you know, definitely not romantic music. And she gave me an ultimatum. She's like, "You have to take this off, or else we have to stop." And I was like, "I can't. I'm so sorry. I can't take this off."
Wow.
and so, you know, I then played that for friends of mine, and I remember we would go around in my car and I'd put on the tapes, and they got really into it. But being in the Northeast, especially in Western Massachusetts at that point, there was this jam band scene, but without cell phones and without the social networks, you know, being what they are now. Word of mouth was the social network, but also in tape trading, you would put filler at the end of a tape. So I would have a Grateful Dead tape, and then the last 20 minutes of it would be Phish, or I'd get a Phish tape, and the last 20 minutes of it would be Ominous Sea Pods. And the Ominous Sea Pods were from Albany, which was, you know, I want to say like an hour and a half from where I was in Great Barrington. And I was able, you know, at this point I can drive. I wasn't over 21, but I could go to the 18 plus shows and try to sneak in. And just, you know, I could be places. And so where the music was happening, like the Iron Horse, which I believe at the time was 16 plus, that I could go to. And then I started putting Disco Biscuits on as filler for Phish, trying to spread the gospel that way. But then by doing that, you meet people in the community, and it was, as we've been saying all along, it was a much different time. And so when I would go to, I went actually to this club called Valentine's in Albany to see Leftover Salmon, because people on Wrecked Music Phish were talking about them. and saying this is a bluegrass band that isn't what you think of bluegrass and whatever. And so I remember going there and having to get the band to sneak me in because it was an over 18 show and I was, maybe 17. And they snuck me in, and then by doing that, not only did I meet the band, but I also met fans inside, and nobody was looking on their phone. You're sitting around with 30, 40 other people, maybe 50 people, and you're just there. You're just in a room waiting for hours. And so, for the band to come on and at set break, you're stuck there together. And so and especially when you're that age, you're not so insular and you're not just stuck in your own friend group, but you meet people. And so, and then from there, you'd find out that they have an email address, which at the time that was, hey, do you have email? It was a 50-50. But if they had said yes, then you could be in touch with them and say, hey, this ominous sea pods are coming to my school, and it's free for students, but also you can probably come on campus and see, things like that were happening.
Mm-hmm. Now, what ties did you maintain to your community back in Pennsylvania? Because as I mentioned before, the Elizabeth, Mechanicsburg, State College, Harrisburg area was an original hotspot of activity for the Disco Biscuits. You're off in Western Mass now. You've got the Bug, and what a great location to be. You've got Northampton, Hartford, Albany. You can get to Worcester, Boston, Providence, and every one of those towns had, Providence had Max Creek and ominous sea pods up in upstate New York, Mo in upstate New York. You had these bands that were staking out their territory, starting to collaborate, the first sort of semblance of a scene forming. But what was going on back in Pennsylvania at this point? Were you aware of the scene there, or did you have a foot still in that territory?
Well, first of all, since you mentioned Mo, I want to say around this time, Mo was doing once a week. They weren't doing a residency, so it wasn't as rigid as once a week, but a few times a month. They were playing at the Iron Horse Music Hall for $5. And it was a place where a lot of Fish fans would go, to see Mo, because Mo hadn't become the band that you want to be following around at that point. They were just, and morons, which is what they call their fan base. But there were a lot of people that were just in the larger scene in general, looking for an outlet and looking for bands to, other bands and things to do. Back in Pennsylvania, I remember I came back there. Some of my friends from high school were getting, a few of them were into the Grateful Dead, and so they were kind of adjacent. I remember trying to play Fish for some of them at some parties and get-togethers, and it wasn't very. None of them transferred over into the Disco Biscuits per se. I did meet somebody that you and I both know very, very well, Carla No, at a G Love show at the Chameleon Club in Lancaster, PA, because she had a Fish summer shirt, a Fish summer tour shirt on with the tour dates listed on the back. And I kind of jokingly said, "Hey, that was my summer vacation," and we, immediately hit it off. And I ended up seeing, I don't know if either of us would have a count, but we've seen so many Disco Biscuit shows together, and Fish shows for that matter too. But that, and so she was Central PA, and around that time, I also became friends with people that now are names in the Disco Biscuit scenes, or at least history, like Jason Malham from Malstock fame, and friends like that. Jeremy Sheely, who ended up drawing one of the Disco Biscuits' first logo, the volcano, amongst other notable things that he's done in the scene, and just being such a great part of it. This community that was coming together, and the community that we're talking about up in Massachusetts at school was one thing. But then when I should have, before coming on, looked up the date of my very first Disco Biscuit show. I don't know it offhand. It was at the Blue Terrapin, and I'm pretty sure that it was the first show that they played at the Blue Terrapin.
how did you find your way to the Blue Terrapin that night? And set the stage for people who might not be familiar with the legendary Blue Terrapin.
So the Blue Terrapin was in a house that was converted into a bar in Elizabethtown, PA, and it was run by. At the time, I remember thinking, they let anybody own a bar? Like they let people like us own a bar, because they weren't professional. They were heads. They were hippies, and but older and apparently somewhat business minded, because they ran this bar, and it became, again, pre-internet. You needed physical places to hang out and to meet and to trade information, even if it didn't feel like it wasn't like, I'm going to go out to the Blue Terrapin and trade information with strangers. It wasn't like, it was like, I'm going to go and hang out. And then in the process of it, somebody tells you about this band Grinch, and somebody says, hey, next week, this band from Michigan called Karmic is going to come and play, so there are all these, these jam bands that were forming, post Fish jam bands, because previously there were a lot of dead jam bands that were New Potato Caboose comes to mind. There were there were Zen Tricksters. Yeah. There were
and
lot
these were the bands that when this culture kind of came into existence, they were the bands that filled in the spaces between tour.
That's right. There
wasn't so much a sense of, oh, I'm going to go on Zen Tricksters tour. And I don't know if those bands even did something we would consider touring back then. They played locally. Maybe sometimes they'd do a one-nighter, an hour or 2 hours away, but it wasn't so much like what we think of now with fall tour and, how many shows are you going to see? It was more like, oh, it's a Tuesday night. I want to hang out with people like me. I'll go see this band that maybe I heard of the last time I was at the venue, or got some filler on a tape, or saw an ad in the Homegrown Music Network, or on one of these burgeoning websites or message boards, someone mentioned, oh, you should check this band out if they exist. So I assume you were just kind of back in Harrisburg. If this was the 1997, there was a show at the Blue Terrapin in May and July. So probably you're home for summer or something
May
like
1997. I was home. I took some time off school at that point before going back. And when I went back, I went to UMass. And so I had taken that time off. I went to the Blue Terrapin quite a bit, especially once the Disco Biscuits started playing there. I have a streak where I think I missed one Blue Terrapin show. And I think that I'd have to go back and look at my stats to be sure of that. But I'm pretty sure that I missed just one Blue Terrapin show. And I remember at the time, before missing that one, I was going for a perfect attendance. And that's how I know that I was at the very first Blue Terrapin show, which there were about 5 to 7 people in the audience. One of them was John Lesser, who was not running sound that night, or maybe that was his first night running sound. History, confuses that for me. But it was either he hadn't been officially hired by the band yet, because they didn't have an official position to hire anybody yet. But he was there, and I remember that night, it was like you were saying, like it was, hey, let's go out. It's a Tuesday night. Let's have something to do with music that I like, in terms of the style and in terms of it's a brand new genre. These bands were, not trying to open up the can of worms of how influential Fish was on any of these bands, the Disco Biscuits or others, but nonetheless, they did not sound like your Grateful Dead spinoff band. There was a new era with a new sound that was being formed in front of our very eyes. And this era of the Disco Biscuits was pre, Magnet didn't have the JP, that there was no electronica side to it yet. They were very much, if anything, I would have described them as a jazz jam band.
Keeping in compliance with the noise ordinance of Elizabethtown, the Disco Biscuits play jazz. We do, in fact, want to state that we would like to rock out all night long. But, the goddamn police.
They were doing Frank Zappa covers. They were doing jazz covers, and they weren't playing Phish covers, even though they had done that, or playing Grateful Dead covers, even though they had done that. But they were covering all these other bands, and Santana they covered as well, and their sound was very raw, very unrefined. A lot of that had to do with the actual, if there was Lesser's first day at the soundboard had shown. And because I remember the tapes from it sounding very muddled, but yes. I also remember that as muddled as it sounded, the Biscuits stood out to me immediately as something that was slightly different than all the other bands that I was seeing at the time that weren't Phish would have been God Street Wine, would have been Ominous Sea Pods, and just bands in that general category. But of the first wave of jam bands. Also, I do have to say that Horde Tour predated this by a few years, and so 1994, 1995. So there really was that jam band scene. There's a larger jam band scene than the one we're talking about, and that had Blues Traveler, Spin Doctors, Rusted Root, and From Good Homes was one of those bands. And that was happening at the same time that I was falling in love with Phish. And, and also at that time, the Allman Brothers were a very active touring band and were very much a part of that whole scene. Dave Matthews Band as well. Dave Matthews Band, who I first heard of because they were the band that was opening for Phish down in the South that season, did like 2 or 3 shows. And then, and then Medeski Martin Wood comes into play at some point around here. But when I saw the Disco Biscuits, they didn't have an original sound yet, other than to say that by default, because their vocals, didn't sound like any other vocalists, we should say. And even their playing, it was very much, they were influenced by all these things, Phish included, Grateful Dead included, but also many other influences. And you could hear it, and you could hear how exceptional they were. And their early compositions, Vasilios was a brand new song at that time, and Pat and Debts, these early songs that to me had something academic to it that I really liked, that I really gravitated towards. I was like, oh, this is like if you had to do homework about composing what at the time was the brand new jam band, saying it was like some of these songs, Shem Rabu, fell right into that. But without them having their own unique sonic sound, I remember one of my best friends at the time, I took him to the Blue Terrapin to see them play the night before we were going down to see Phish at Hampton Coliseum. And he said to me that he was like, he goes, they're not original. They don't sound, they're not original. So they're not really doing something that nobody else is, but they are doing it almost better than most of the, and then I remember we were talking with Brownie, outside, and I remember Brownie saying that, and he told Brownie as well, I'm here to see Phish with Benjy. We're going down to Hampton, and Brownie said something along the lines of, see, when I first saw Phish, I thought that I want to do that. And Brownie's like, I went home and I decided this is what I wanted to do. And I remember saying, that's funny, because when I saw Phish was when I gave up trying to be a guitar player, because I said, you know what, anything that I could ever want to do on guitar is already being done 5 times better by this guy, and then that's also how I felt about Barber when I saw his playing. I'm like, well, there's no way that I could ever do that. So instead I can watch it, I can follow it, and I can enjoy it. And I can write about it.
I've often thought that the Biscuits differentiated themselves from a lot of the other emerging bands in the scene at that point, at this moment, when the concept of jam bands was being formalized through relics, but then through a new generation of information clearinghouses, not just the rec music boards, but also things like kdeal.com. It had his little fellow travelers section at the bottom. Dean Budnick was working on his book on jamband culture, which bestowed the name upon the scene. Andy Bernstein and Larry Chasnoff and others were having a section in the Farmer's Almanac dedicated to up-and-coming bands. But what the Biscuits did that differentiated them, for me at least, was they seemed like they had a scholarly understanding of jam bands, of Phish, of the Dead, that they had somehow become the meta jam band. The jam band that looked at what other jam bands were doing, synthesized it and built on it and extended it into new ways. In 1997, they were still finding their footing. Probably more accurate to say that by 98, 99 is when this really came into fruition, when they had a rock opera or three, when they began inventing the concepts of inverted songs, when the set list chicanery that they've come to be known for. But a lot of that was drawn from looking at what Phish did in particular, Brownstein's absolute adoration of Phish, and saying, like you just described in that conversation, I want to do that, but not just to do that as a cover band, not just to emulate what he's seen, but to take it another step further and another step further and further and further until it became its perhaps one of the only, there are a limited number of original offshoots of jam band culture. And I think we can confidently say that the Disco Biscuits and Transfusion is one of them.
And it was incredible to watch that unfold in real time, because with Phish, when I came to Phish, they were already, you can say they're to this day constantly evolving, but they had their identity, their musical identity. With the Disco Biscuits, like I said, the first times that I saw them, the first number of times, I would not have said that they had a musical identity that was unique. They were just incredibly talented young scrappers that were my age and that were accessible to the point where I could talk to them before, set break, and after their shows. Sometimes even when they were on stage.
Sometimes during.
Yeah, sometimes during. I mean, if Kevin Sturtz's tennis court, and there's just a bunch of people around and they're figuring out what to play next, I could go up there and heckle them or bring them beers or whatever it was.
That was for Benjy Eisen. Would like everyone to sit down and have a smoke with him right here in the front. Mr. Eisen, the guru. The guru.
They were all scholars of music as well, and they're all intellectuals. And so to be able to have these intellectual conversations with them, philosophical conversations about music, about the possibilities of improvisation, about how does, I remember having conversations with BARBER that involved how does he on the one hand explore improvisation in a way that lightened up all the parts of his brain and that was very enjoyable for him as an exercise, versus knowing that you're on stage playing in front of people and you also have to keep them entertained and keep them dancing, and so to be able to have that. Phish wasn't accessible to me in terms of the people, the musicians. They were a famous band. With the Disco Biscuits, it was in the parking lot afterwards. Sometimes I remember playing Phish, tapes for Brownie. I remember him playing Grateful Dead tapes for me. I remember us collectively in your basement, actually, listening to The Slip after the Disco Biscuits played Brown University, and I had the slip tape, and I remember playing it, and it made Brownie really upset because he was convinced that there was more than one bass player, and was trying to wrap his mind around what they were doing musically. And I remember also being at Penn State with the Disco Biscuits during a spring fling or something, where this other band that was fast rising from the West, or from the Midwest rather, from Colorado, called the String Cheese Incident. And I remember watching them with Magner and with BARBER, and we had this conversation about bluegrass, and we had mixed feelings about bluegrass and mixed feelings about what String Cheese were doing with it. And I remember Barber having this light bulb go off in his head where he said, the BPM, he's like, they're playing what we're playing. It's just, it's on a different, like, and he was seeing the similarities versus, you know, I think I was probably saying the differences, and he was seeing this, you know, he was really excited about that. And about that musical breakthrough. And then, of course, there was Flapjacks, right, in Dillsburg, PA, where at any given point, one of the things I loved about the Disco Biscuits during that whole era was that you didn't know what you were getting that night, because they were trying so hard to just not just find their own footing, but they were exploring every corner that they could, as while they're kind of like, you know, when you think about a kid and you talk about, oh, they're experimenting, you know, like whether it's with drugs or whether it's with identities, whether it's with clothing, you know, they're in their goth phase. The Disco Biscuits had this experimental phase where they knew that they were a jam band by default because they like to improvise and that, you know, and all this, but they also were trying to find where in that they fit. So one night they had a funk. I remember one night leaving the Blue Terrapin being like, that was a funk band. And then another night being like that, they were a jazz band tonight. And, you know, and another night, oh, they, you know, I think there was a night where they weren't all in great moods. And I remember being like, oh, they were like a rock band, like a harder edge rock band. I think it was at a fraternity actually where I remember having that thought. And then along came Flapjacks, where the band in front of our very eyes learned that you don't need to play a song straight through, and you don't even need to you know, the previously known concept of doing half of a song bookending. They're like, it doesn't even need to be like that. You can take parts of songs, play them out of order. You can, you know, and it's all just music and it's all just parts, and they can go anywhere. Afterwards talking about that night, because it wasn't, you know, it was like he learned about it and he thought about it and he was trying to figure out what it meant after actually doing it.
Yeah. It was an organic process of discovery on a nightly basis. On a nightly
basis, but that night in particular, I think, was a milestone for them, because that was really the night where they learned, hey, we can throw it all up in the air and we can see where the parts land and we can connect them, you know, and at that point, inverted, dyslexic, those terms hadn't, you know, they weren't even concepts yet. And the Biscuits were figuring that out.
Well, we're going to come back to that show and that week, that month, that tour, that year of 1999 in a moment. But I wanted to loop back to the time period between your first exposure to the Biscuits at the Blue Terrapin in May 97 and everything that came next. How did you go from seeing them casually when the schedules lined up, they're in town on a Tuesday night or whatever, to seeing them more regularly and ultimately to having those relationships with them? And we know that they were very accessible back then. So many of us who have been around for 25 plus years have very similar stories of went to a show, no one was there, smoked some weed with Brownstein and Lesser at set break, and 25, 30 years, we're still here. That's my story, at least. But how did you go from seeing them, thinking it was an interesting show, to having a relationship with the band and their music?
Well, I mean, it was very similar, I think, as to what you just described, and to many people's experiences at this time, including some of the people that I think invariably we're about to mention. But I think that, I mean, I was at that very first Blue Terrapin show. As I had said, I saw something in them that was beyond where they were yet as a band, but you could tell their raw talent and their energy and their dedication. And then speaking to them, it was like they spoke my language. English. No, but they like, and talking to them as people, we were very like-minded people. And also, they were Ivy League students. They could talk articulately about music, and at the same time, when we were getting high at set break in the backstage, which at the Blue Terrapin, I believe, was one of their one of the owner's apartments, we could talk about other things other than music, and we found that we had a very common ground, and coming from these I don't want to say similar families, but kind of we had the same context. We were growing up in America at the same time and into the same things, and intellectually curious about a lot of the same things that didn't just that extended beyond music, but that like attracts like, right? And so I think that this type of music attracted and still does a certain type of person, and so it was being so excited by that. And the Disco Biscuits had an incredible I think intentional strategy early on of fan retention, where they would very intentionally make it a point to go around the room. If there's less than 10 people in the room seeing them, they would all go and meet everybody and talk to them, and then keep in touch with them. And I remember, I don't know if it was Brownie or if it was Barber, but I remember having, we had each other's phone numbers. It was landlines, and I remember. I think it was Barber or Madner that called my parents' house to tell me that they were coming back to the Blue Terrapin, and naturally I told all of my friends, because I'm like, this band, they even called me, and I grabbed Jason Melham and the people that formed New Market Productions, which did the original Melstock, Jeremy Sheely, Carla, these people, we all just started, at the Blue Terrapin seeing them. But then I realized that I wanted to see them whenever I could, but it wasn't at that point, like they weren't really a tour band, and they were based out of Philadelphia, and they were filling their schedule. They weren't doing tours. They were playing as much as they could. It wasn't like, here, we're going to do 40 dates and then take a month off. It was, we're going to do as many shows this week as we can, as many shows next week as we can. And the same general markets, because it wasn't, it was a drive. They were doing shows that were a drive from them. And therefore, being just over in Harrisburg from Philadelphia, shows that were a drive for me. And when they played Philadelphia, I would go early to their house, and then from there go to the show. And sometimes even in the van with them or whatever it was. And I think that there were people like Carla and Gop, Mark Goplis. Those two in particular were based out of State College, and the Disco Biscuits started playing State College pretty regularly. Cafe 210 West initially, before they graduated to the Crowbar, and they were playing it with such regularity, as well as the Blue Terrapin. They kind of had this, like, I don't know what the word for it is, other than it was like spokes on a wheel, with Philadelphia being the center. And they kept on going out, and there were a lot of these places that, to me, being, having a car and having the autonomy and enough, living with my parents, but having enough autonomy that I could drive 2 hours to see a show. And especially if I was driving back that night. But at State College, it became, I'll stay at Carla's house. I'll crash on her couch for the Disco Biscuits, and then we'll get on Gop's car and drive down to Maryland to see the Disco Biscuits at the Rec Theater, or the 8x10 or wherever it was that we would go. And we would all kind of, and Angelica, Madner's wife, Angelica, who of course wasn't Angelica Madner at that time, was also a part of the scene I'm talking about, and this tight knit group of people where we would carpool for Fish and for the Disco Biscuits. And the Disco Biscuit scene, because it was hyper local, was growing more. Whereas with Fish, I would go to, and I became, as you alluded to, I became a more vocal part of their online community, and there would be online meetups. And so that when they would play at certain shows, would have a fish.net gathering in town, at the microbrewery or whatever beforehand. But these are people that because of distance and because we didn't have cell phones in our pockets and we didn't have texting and it was all through email. And even then we didn't have constant access to it because we would have to, in my case, I'd have to go into my dad's home office to get on the computer. And so it was much more spread out. Whereas the Disco Biscuits, by being hyper local, Carla could say, "Hey, you should call me up on the landline and say, hey, I'm coming home for the weekend. Let's get together. I'll pick you up and let's go around." And we would go around in her car listening, listening to different things. Because I would be like, here's the Fish playing Cities from Prague, and she'd be like, I just got this Disco Biscuits tape, and we would drive around listening to it. And Clay was another one of these characters. Uno Clay, as some people know him as. And it was this cast of characters that was forming what became the early Disco Biscuits scene. And we weren't tour heads only because they weren't doing those tours, but we were tour heads in that you could reliably find us at most of the times at these shows, and they were so small that if there's 100 people there and you recognize those 10, you're gonna, those are your people. And so we were forming a Disco Biscuit family from that, and because it was so small, the Disco Biscuits themselves were part of that glue and part of the conversation, to the point where, as I had mentioned earlier about being in your basement, it was because the Disco Biscuits were playing at Brown and they said, "Hey, we're staying at Madsen's basement," and then you invited me as well and other people as well. And I remember, do you remember how many people that were there that slept over that night?
I just remember that a few days later, you were still at my house. And it was great.
Yeah.
I loved it. It was our spring fling, and it felt like the entire Disco Biscuits universe had descended upon Brown in Providence. And I just wanted it to keep going because it was this strange phenomenon, as you were describing. Your friends, your community, you were all spread out. And you had just enough technology to be able to coordinate, to be able to plan where you're going to be, but not enough to be in touch on a daily basis. There was kind of an epistolary culture. We would write each other long emails.
That's right.
Big long posts on Discuss Biscuits, the band's original email distribution mailing list system. But those moments where we actually got to be in each other's presence were very rare.
It was easy at Disco Biscuit shows to find your community, to find your people, because those shows were so small and intimate. Whereas at Fish, it was, this is why there are these phrases that page side high, or even just page
BSP.
side period. Yeah, exactly. It was because we didn't have ways of communicating, and so it was inside a show that size. Go to this general area and hopefully you run into your friends, or beforehand. Oftentimes on the road, it would be like, okay, cool, I will meet you outside the bot's office. I'll go there every half hour until before the show, until we meet up, because I have your ticket. And it would be things like that. And a lot of it was a lot of who you ran into. It wasn't just luck because you'd set it up, but it wasn't a given factor. You couldn't just text them and say, "Hey, where are you?"
So you mentioned the State College scene, Uno Clay, Carla No, many others who would go on to be very much the glue that tied a lot of these different disparate local scenes together. People who kind of bounced between these different regional hotspots. But what is your recollection of seeing shows in State College back then, and of that scene, of the Uno crew? They had a very unique and creative culture that I think was generative of a lot of stuff that would spill out onto Fish Tour and jam band culture in general.
Yeah, I think so. State College, PA, like many college campuses in the Northeast at that point, had a burgeoning Fish scene, to the point where there was a tape collectors weekly meetup, And Carla can tell you more about it because it's such a vague memory for me since I wasn't living in State College. But I do remember going to one. It was like at a pizza shop, and you would go with your tape, with your tape list, and meet other people, and then agree to trade those tapes. And the Disco Biscuits scene, kind of reflective of my own experience, it kind of grew out of that Fish scene, but became a more niche part of it, or just a more concentrated part of it, and more active, because Fish would tour, and they played State College in the spring of 1994, and then the next time they came back, and that was it in the gymnasium there. And the next time they came back, they were in the arena, and the Disco Biscuits were playing State College pretty regularly, to the point where I just remember going up there all the time, like sometimes every other week, and again staying over at Carla's place, and then meeting up with our friends. And there was overlap when Fish came to town, because when Fish did go to the arena, it would be the Disco Biscuits played, I think, the night before at Cafe 210 West. And that's an infamous night because I remember that members of Fish were in the audience. I remember Fishman was at the bar doing shots of tequila. Meanwhile, Trey had found his way into sound check and for the Disco Biscuits, and a bunch of us, including Carla and Angelica, were already there. And I remember when he came in, that I remember I had a Disco Biscuit cassette in my pocket, and I don't remember what show it was anymore, but I remember handing it to him and him saying, "Is this your band?" And me going, "No, it's that band, the one that's on stage." The other memory I have from that night was BARBER in their wild improvisation. BARBER accidentally started playing The Lick That Is My Soul, I think. And I just remember looking at him and looking at Trey and making a sign. And I remember him immediately pivoting and changing. And in his mind, and I remember talking to him that night, he wasn't quoting My Soul. It was, I forget what he said it was. It was, it's a blues lick, it's a Roadhouse blues or something. but it definitely was. And I just remember being like, do you really want to be doing that? But that night was infamous because it also, it was a sold out show for the Disco Biscuits. And I think a lot of Phish fans, you know, the Disco Biscuits first scene was all Phish fan overflow. And, you know, it was predominantly Phish fans in the audience at Disco Biscuit shows back in those days. And that's where they found new recruits, you know, and their word of mouth. And that's where I made it kind of, without consciously thinking of it as such, it was kind of a mission of mine to spread the word of the Disco Biscuits only because of my passion for it. And, you know, I think many of us, when we're passionate about anything, we want to share it with our friends and with our communities. And this was something that I knew would connect with the Phish community. So I wore a Disco Biscuits t-shirt at all these Phish shows for a long time. Because especially if I was going to be like at Penn State, I remember being in the front row. And so I remember like wearing the Disco Biscuits shirt and making sure to stand up and turn around so people saw it, you know, like guerrilla marketing tactics and putting them on as filler on the tapes, as we mentioned earlier.